Hello and welcome to a new series interview. And today I'm actually quite excited because we have with us one of the global leaders and thought leaders and as well researchers, Professor Ryan Abbott, that is one of the leading authorities in AI. So welcome to our series, Professor Ryan.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here.
So I will start by reading a bit of some of your achievements because I think it's interesting for our audience and I think it's quite impressive. So Professor Ryan Abbott is highly regarded for his scholarship, teaching and professional activities. He's the author of Reasonable Robot, Artificial Intelligence and the Law, published in 2020 by Cambridge University Press. And he has published widely on issues associated with law and technology, health law and intellectual property, in leading legal, medical, and scientific books and journals. And Professor Abbott's research has been featured prominently in media, from New York Times to Financial Times, Forbes, and Vice. And he routinely gives keynote speech and lectures in academic international organizations like MIT, Stanford, Oxford, and Cambridge. And as well, he's been working with governments and organizations like the World Intellectual Property Organization, World Trade Organization, UK International Property Office, and in terms of industry, AIPPI, American Chemical Society, and INTERPAT. And as well, he's been looking and writing in all these areas. And the Managing Intellectual Property magazine named him as one of the 50 most influential people in intellectual property in 2019. So this area is a massive area, especially now with AI becoming the next frontier of humanity. But I'm particularly interested as well in the work that Professor Ryan Abbott has been working in terms of the areas outside of general counsel and in the areas of life science and companies related with that. He has been served as a consultant or expert for international organizations, academic institutions and non-profit enterprise, including the United Kingdom Parliament, European Commission, World Health Organization, and the World Intellectual Property Organization. And as well has been working and witness and a particularly interesting case in testifying in the US federal court related to some of these areas. So as a base, Professor Ryan Abbott is a licensed physician, attorney, and a comparist, which is quite interesting as well, in the United States, and as well as solicitor advocate in England and Wales. So he's been actually between the US and the UK. And he's certified by the American Board of Legal Medicine. So a lot of background in terms of different areas. And as well, he has a summa cum laude graduate from Emperor's College and summa cum laude graduate from University of California, Los Angeles. So quite impressive, and welcome to, and as well has been leading as well some of the departments in the University of Surrey as well. I think it's interesting to mention as well. So welcome to our series. It's actually a privilege to have you here, and I'm quite excited because all these areas are, for me, my playground and my sandbox. So thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for the overly generous introduction. I'll do my best.
No, I think it's just part of the iceberg. So, but it's quite exciting. So, well, I want to start by.
You didn't include how much student debt I accumulated doing all that, but I guess that's another interview.
No, I don't think you can mention that in your background. So, but well, one of the things I want to start is, so you have a very diverse background that touches two areas that are very different, from physician to attorney, and as well a comparist. I'm particularly interested as well all these different mixes, but as well, of course, you've been accumulating an academic massive work. So can you tell us a bit about your background, your studies? And I think especially I always like to go probably to childhood education, especially being you as well, an academic.
Oh, well, if we're starting all the way back in childhood, my mother was a business executive at Hewlett-Packard, and my dad was a partner at a law firm now called Pillsbury. He left that and became a law professor, and so I actually ended up following a bit in his footsteps. But he tried very hard to talk me out of being a lawyer. In fact, he talked me into going to medical school. And at some point in medical school, I thought, I think I want to be a lawyer. Mostly my students tell me they went to law school because they couldn't stand the sight of blood or didn't like science, but I went in the opposite direction. And ending up finishing both of those degrees, I thought, well, what do I do now? And I thought one interesting way to combine medicine and law was doing intellectual property issues in life sciences. So things like, how do pharmaceutical companies protect new medicines, or how do we improve access to things like a COVID vaccine in places like Africa? And so that is largely the area that I work in. I started teaching in Los Angeles, and then I was recruited by University of Surrey in about 2016. And moving to England has been a great adventure for myself and my family. And now I split my time between the two places, and have grown to quite like England.
Wow, amazing. So that comes from the family, the background, the special of law. So, and as well in terms of this first part, so you've been working with a lot of different universities and a lot of different research. So I would like to get from the law to especially the background that you've been making, the bridge between law and technology, and as well, of course, all the expertise. So can you tell us, how did you start looking at that? Because law is a massive field and there's so much different things there. And as well, of course, you have as well a bridge with healthcare that comes from your background, or as well from the research that you did there. But how did you get into these details on that level?
Yeah, and it is interesting that I do most of my academic research now with artificial intelligence, and I don't have a technical background in artificial intelligence, but I was doing two things several years ago. One is I was working as a law professor, and I was teaching patent law, and I was teaching the law on what makes someone an inventor on a patent. And at the same time, I was also working as an attorney for life science companies, and I was filing and prosecuting patents, basically for new medical inventions. And in that role, there were a lot of companies that were offering services. And if you don't know this, you can basically outsource the entire drug development process at just about every stage to a contract research organization. If you want someone to do your clinical trials or to find a new antibody to a target that you have, you can outsource that sort of research. And the companies were at least advertising that they were having artificial intelligence do a lot of the work that someone used to do. So for example, if you had a therapeutic target, an antigen that you wanted a new drug for, they said they would have an artificial intelligence search a large library of antibodies and find the right antibody to treat your antigen. Before you went into clinical trials, they would have an artificial intelligence do in silico analysis, which is basically computer modeling of how a drug works, some of its characteristics, maybe what the right dose would be, maybe if there were some drug-drug interactions or so forth. And it occurred to me, that's interesting, because these companies are now saying that they're having machines doing the sorts of things that a person used to do. And when a person used to do it, you used to be able to file for a patent on it. Well, I thought, well, what happens then if you have a machine doing this instead of a person? And could you even get a patent on that? And I wondered if anyone had ever thought about it. Well, it turns out people had thought about it. In fact, people had been writing about this question since the 1960s. But writing about it and sort of saying, well, if a machine invents something, you really don't need intellectual property protection because machines don't care about patents. And while that is no doubt true, the people who are using and building and investing in machines do care about patents, especially in places like the life sciences. And so if we have an AI, say from Microsoft, being used by Novartis, and the AI finds a cure for COVID, it would be really problematic if you couldn't protect that sort of invention and you would have to rely on a person doing it, even if the person wasn't as good. And that set me down the path of noticing that as AI gets better and better and cheaper and starts stepping into the shoes of people, there are two different legal regimes that apply to behavior by a person and behavior by a machine. And sometimes this has bad sorts of outcomes.
Well, this is in itself a massive field, because I think what is going to happen as we get all the areas of AI, and as well, so I think there will be three levels. There will be the level of what is created by humans, what is created by teams, and all the collaborations between different, because almost all technology is based on APIs and different interactions of code. And as well, then what is starting to be created as well by AI in itself. So that brings me to the background of actually your book. and as well the work you've been doing, especially the reasonable robots, artificial intelligence, and the law. So I would probably go through this before we go to the academic, because you touched this area, and I think this is a massive field. So I think probably starting to this is a good one. So can you contextualize the book and as well the work that you did, because it's a very fresh book still. It's from last year, but I think it's a very powerful book, and I think the title is it opens the field, and of course the topics around the book are really impressive. So I just want to a bit touched if you could give a bit of context about that for our audience, and as well these topics. How do you relate the reasonable robots and as well the AI and law?
Sure, and thank you for that. Well, so if we pick up where we left off, where I was noticing that AI was doing some of the sorts of things that people used to do in an inventive space instead of a person, but we had different legal rules for this, and sometimes this has bad outcomes. The book is basically looking at that phenomenon across law, or at least in 4 different areas: tax, tort, intellectual property, and criminal law. And it is observing the fact that you can have a machine functionally do exactly the same thing that a person would do, whether that is operating an automatic teller at McDonald's, or driving a self-driving Tesla instead of an Uber driver, or making a painting or a song, or inventing a new thing, or even going out and harming people in ways we think of as being deliberate. But different rules apply to when you have a machine doing that and when you have a person doing that. And the book argues that it's often not good to have a different standard for this sort of thing. So for example, in the intellectual property space, if machines are going to be the way that we invent new things in the future, or if machines are going to start writing articles and making music that doesn't suck quite so badly as it sucks now, if it's going to get to a place where people actually want to listen to that stuff, it isn't a very good system where you have protection only for human things but not for machine things. At least not if what we want is to encourage people to make machines create new things. And it's not just intellectual property. So if you look at torts, for example, if a self-driving car causes an accident, we have a different liability standard for that. We hold it strictly liable as a commercial product. Whereas if a person causes an accident, we hold them liable in negligence. So only if a reasonable person wouldn't have caused an accident do we hold them liable. Well, if a machine and a person are doing exactly the same thing driving a car, we don't really want to have different liability standards for this, because that discourages people from using machines even if they're safer, because we're holding them to higher liability standards. And actually, perhaps more concerningly, in 20 years, if machines are pretty much absolutely safe, if they never cause an accident driving a car, we're holding people to a much lower liability standard than a machine. And that's not right, because we want to encourage the safer standard to be used. So the book argues that what we often want is to hold people and machines to the same standards, or at least to hold people and machines to the same standard of behavior. And the book argues it kind of doesn't matter whether a machine thinks or knows what it's doing, because the law is often concerned with regulating behavior. And we have a legal standard in the law based on reasonableness in many areas like criminal law, contracts, and torts, where we don't ask, well, why was a person doing something or what were they thinking? We just say, what would a reasonable person have done? And let's require that standard of behavior out of everyone. And in the same sort of way, the book is essentially arguing we should be holding machines to standards of reasonableness, and sometimes holding people to the same standard of reasonableness we'd hold a machine to. And if we do this, it is a principle of AI regulation that I think will result in all of us getting more benefit from AI and helping to minimize its risks.
That opens a minefield in a lot of areas. So I want to be a bit provocative. So, and of course I subscribe to the book, and it's something that I'm actually studying myself because it's a critical element. So, but let's say if you look at the definition of AI and as well definition of humanity, which is 2 different things, because in the end of the day, if you look at evolution, evolution normally has been mostly a capacity for humanity or the species to adapt to the environment and different things. And in the end of the day, the AI is partly an evolution of humanity. But the point right now is that we have incipient AI then you have medium AI, and you're going to have advanced AI. And so how do you see this kind of, if you look this from a perspective of humanity values and all our civilizational values, and at the end, there's all the part of the law, very practical, that you mentioned in your book, but this brings a huge minefield in terms of, first of all, the areas of philosophy, the areas of definition of humanity, and the areas of evolution. Because let's say, for instance, there's a great quote that I love. For instance, if an AI decides that is looking at cancer research, and it just decides that I want to erase, it's better to erase all these people because they're weak, so they have less possibility of evolving, or that if this AI will start thinking on its own. But then before the AI, and coming back to your book, I don't want to get out of focus, is that someone will program this machine, and this machine will have partly a code that is programmed by humans, by some scientific lab or university, or both, because at the moment there's normally any project, especially with AI, interacts with a lot of different things. But let's say if the AI is constructed in the US or in the UK or in Russia, it's completely different. So we are talking already about 3 different laws, different ways, even cultural background. And of course, if you go to China, we have another one. So I know that this is a minefield, but I think your book touches so broad. So I'm particularly, because no one actually, I think it's my main obsession is that at this stage, or you're going to be creating a very dystopic humanity and a very dystopic contextualized, or you're going to be creating a very monstrous, actually even monstrous future, or you create something like Star Trek, which is actually more human. You can actually have that part. But at the same time, coming back to your expertise and research field, is that in the end of the day, all of this will be defined by the law behind the code and the people that are partly doing the patents and doing the research. So I would like to hear your thoughts on this.
Sure. Well, they're all great and important questions as we struggle with how to regulate AI. And I think, in fact, you've made the case for why it is important to regulate AI. This is not something that you want entirely to leave up to everyone to do whatever they want with, because clearly there is a potential for people to do very bad things with AI. And, as with really any area of human behavior, we have the law to have at least some restrictions on the sorts of things that people can do, in the name of mitigating risks that someone's behavior can cause to someone else, and helping ensure that as benefits come out of AI, that they are both, maximized and spread somewhat fairly, so they don't all go just to Jeff Bezos. Not that I'm objecting to him getting a little bit of the benefit from that, but you raised quite a few issues in that. And part of it is, the regulatory landscape for AI is complex, and it's not just law or binding regulations. It's a lot of things. It's people's own moral and ethical codes. It's cultural norms. It's industry standards. Yes, there are binding sorts of regulations that say, you can't mount a machine gun on a drone and send it out to shoot people. But there are all these different ways in which we constrain people from doing bad things with behavior, and they all have an important role to play. And there is already a body of regulations that governs what one can do with AI. It just often is a body of regulations that wasn't designed with AI in mind. Some of these rules, date back decades, and lawmakers weren't thinking about this sort of thing, in the same way that lawmakers weren't thinking about the internet, or weren't thinking about software, or weren't thinking about automobiles. And as technology evolves, we need as a society to take a step back, think about what we want to be doing with AI, what we want not to be doing with AI, and what rules and regulations can get us to the right place. And some of it does vary culturally, right? You see a very different attitude towards things like data ownership or personal privacy in China versus the United Kingdom, and some of that is probably something that we think, globally should be harmonized, and that's where we maybe have a role for things like the World Intellectual Property Organization, or, regional efforts like through the European Commission to help harmonize some of these things. But these are the questions we want to be thinking about in determining how to regulate AI. You touched earlier on, what it means to be human in an age of AI. And I think, for right now, that's still pretty clear. And, people talk about giving rights to artificial intelligence. And my own view is that is, somewhat, not the right way to approach the question. AI, of all the AI we have today, is still, not like a person. It doesn't have its own intrinsic feelings about things. It doesn't have a self of, a sense of self. It isn't artificial general intelligence or even strong artificial intelligence. It is still something made by and used by people, even if it is improving its own code. But AI can behave like a person. And so it isn't that AI deserves rights because it is morally deserving, but it is that sometimes AI needs to be regulated more like a legal entity because it can behave in ways that humans can behave and thus needs to be regulated in the same sorts of ways that a human can behave. Now, in the future, we may have a couple very interesting things happening. We may have, what some people call strong AI, which is AI that basically kind of is aware that it exists and has, intrinsic desires. And, that is a whole different ballgame, in my opinion, if you have something like Data from Star Trek versus, a very intelligent machine. It may also be, as people like Elon Musk work on humans evolving, with artificial appendages that are, based in part on artificial intelligence. We do have a change in what it means to be a human being, and we have things like cyborg rights. Those are very interesting questions, but I think those are still questions for the future. But not too early to be talking about them.
Okay, so on that I probably would provoke. I think it's more now than the future because, for instance, I want to provoke a bit on this because you have three hats that I think I respect a lot. So one is the academic researcher, the other one is always you've been, of course, the law part, which is a critical element here, and the third one, of course, is that you've been doing some work with the industry. But the point right now, so let's just speak what you said. So. And I think the point of that happened for us the last 2 years. Okay, so I was actually doing another research and I was looking for this. If you look at, for instance, over there in the US, which is, I think, an interesting case study. And for instance, we have this documentary of Netflix that became quite a big mainstream or a tentative of bringing to mainstream the questions around the AI and data in particular, which is not very advanced, but what happened in the last 4 years with Trump and with all the things on that, not going political, but purely from data perspective, is that most of people, because of the bubble created mostly by AIs, but very incipient AIs, most of them is not even AI. We're talking about machine learning. These people were fought and get into a frame that they think that, okay, and we're talking about 70 million people, so we're not talking about a small amount of people, that they, because of political or cultural or even their background, they start believing in a parallel reality. So, and the point is that if you look at fiction reality, this is not different from Matrix. This happens and this is happening. Okay, we have still a huge, so from I'm talking purely on data, I'm not going political. I think 59% of the people that vote on Trump, they still think that he won the elections. So this is a pure fact, because of course, if you look at law, that means these people think someone broke the law, and the other people, of course, there's the facts and there's the fiction. But this creates a huge disruption that if you look at history or humanity, of course, there was always emperors and civilizations that had, some of them were nicer than others, but the facts always win the battle. But this has happened, and this changed massive, because for instance, if you look, even the same with Brexit, and for instance, here in the UK, the Brexit disrupt the entire economy, and is still disrupting actually. But I'm not going through the political part, I'm just talking from a data perspective. This affects the entire country, and most of this is scientific research stipulates that most of this was based because of use of Facebook to manipulate opinion of large parts of the population using very basic machine learning and retargeting stuff. So business technology is something. So I know that on your research, you're going through a lot of things on the patterns, and I want to go there, but I want to probably push this at the beginning of the conversation. We are fresher, because I think this is for me the biggest challenge, because in one end, let's say, for instance, me and some people in my team, I work in investment bank. Okay, an investment bank, and at first I partly worked for a while with Cambridge Analytica, and thanks God, what I did with them was actually quite nice. But I understood there was some things that were not so nice that they were doing, so I kind of discreetly push out. But what I understood is that what they're doing is not different from any marketeer. Like you said, the marketeers, they're retargeting someone using cookies, and mostly all the biggest tech companies in the world, that's what they do on a daily basis. They're already doing that. So the challenge is that this is already, and I want to talk because one thing is, like you said, advanced AI, and often when you go to all these areas, of course, we're not there, not even close, and we're not close to singularity, but we are already close of a very big disruption that can be done in the space of 1 year or months that can affect the entire global population. And of course, if you have, for instance, knowledge on social media, for instance, I am an influencer in social media, and I am, of course, I'm not massive, but one of the things I learned is how you can manipulate and use technology to manipulate numbers, to get followers, and to create a lot of things. And I think the challenge right now is that even not using AI, we are already creating a very big arsenal that, of course, you can say that, okay, television did that in a massive scale, radio did that. Actually, Orson Welles killed people when he read the H.G. Wells book on the public radio in the beginning of the 20th century. And actually, there were people that committed suicide because they believed that the world was being invented. But I think I just want to talk especially with your hat as an academic and your hat as an expert in law, because the point is that I think this question, I think Professor Harari touched it from a historical perspective on the 21 lessons for the 20th century, and as well in Sapiens. Because if you look at history, normally to get to the stage we are as humans, the human sapiens, it took 30,000 years, more or less. Now we have androids like Sophia the robot or Ida or others that are already getting to a stage of evolution that is massive. And these androids are being honed by private entities that have the right to use data in massive scale. And if they act Facebook, they can do even bigger. So I just want to understand, and as well, for instance, the quantity of data that Facebook has is bigger than any country or multiple countries around the planet. And the same with Google, the same with Amazon, the same with Alibaba. That's why the Chinese government wants to restrict Alibaba independent of the politics, because it's bigger. Their financial capacity is bigger than the country. So I just want to touch these areas. Sorry, I know that is a big one, but I think I would like to have your super mind on this.
Oh, well, you're entirely right. It's a critical area to be thinking about. I was saying things like rights for sentient robots, or a futuristic concern, but the impact of AI is very strong today. And as you point out, one of the areas in which it is most concerning is in political and social manipulation. I think you made a good point as well that it really isn't a new problem. There has been fake news for centuries, and there are plenty of regimes that instill their followers with an alternate, I guess you called it a parallel universe of facts, even without the use of technology. But, technology and these social media platforms have been doing this in kind of new concerning ways, both to the extent to which with the data that you have of someone, you can know a lot more about them than you ever could previously, and the speed and breadth which one can disseminate misinformation over these platforms is really astounding. And I think over the past 4 years, there has been a growing awareness, not only that this is something we should be concerned about, but it's something that has kind of real concrete negative consequences in the way that, our political structures function and trust in government. And I think that, one of the answers that regulators are coming around to is, you can't just totally unregulate what people say on the internet and how these platforms function. And, Facebook hasn't wanted to get into this, because the way it operates right now is very profitable, and, attempts to censor things are politically, fraught. But it is clear to me, at least, that these platforms have an obligation to be enforcing, restrictions on people disseminating misinformation. And that, while there is a role for both kind of industry standards and self-governance, that governments have a role to play in ensuring that certain standards of conduct are adhered to, because promoting misinformation, say about a COVID vaccine, is not just something that is harmless. It is something that, will cost lives. And, as with the Orson Welles scare, it is something that can cost a lot of lives in this day and age if someone does it properly. So I think, I think there is a growing awareness of the need to regulate social media platforms like this, and that governments need to be playing a role in deciding what sort of speech, can be allowed or not on these platforms, and how are we going to enforce it. And that, AI, is not only part of the problem in having, even simple AI promoting misinformation, but also part of the solution, because, there's a limit to what people can do in monitoring these things. And it's often, for example, in the case of child pornography or violent videos, a very dehumanizing experience for a human being to have to curate this. So there is, a bit of an AI arms race here to be had, with AI putting up inappropriate content and also AI taking down inappropriate content.
Yeah, and I think the reason I pushed this at the beginning of the conversation is because your background is quite impressive, because you've been working with some of the leading organizations worldwide. But for instance, I've been advising some governments. I've actually created the digital strategy, at least for one government worldwide, the Malaysian government. But one of the things I found out was the alarming lack of understanding from the governments in these topics. I would say that we have almost three kinds of governance in the planet at the moment. We have the Silicon Valley and the Chinese giants. Then we have, of course, the scientific community like you and a lot of others, and where I'm trying to be as well as part as possible. But then there's a third part that is as well the governments that are completely out of scope. For instance, if you look at the quantity of money invested in technology and the patents and all these different things, so most of the control of technology is on patents. So your work is critical here, but then it's the way all of this dissemination of development and technology and as well regulatory part without, for instance, I interviewed yesterday one of another academic like you, that is a professor from Yale, and she's been actually studying central banks digital currencies, so CDBC, well, central bank, there's a term, I always mix up the formal. But the thing is that, so if you look at this, for instance, at the moment, there's no consensus about central banks digital currencies, but the Chinese did it already. So the point is that they are already 10 years advanced, and mostly you cannot use almost cash if you are in China. So these things create already, that means we have already a massive challenge, even from a very basic regulatory part. I'm not talking from the areas of implications that it has in society. So I would come back to reality and to your work and research. So one of the things that I would like to understand, so especially in the work you've been doing, and coming back to your book, but as well the work you've been doing, especially with the world intellectual property. So I think the only way we can actually get some kind of alignments is to make sure that this data is partly led by intellectuals and researchers like you that have an independent and neutral way of looking at data, and as well creating laws around that. But as well, there's a huge amount of education, because of course, most of the politicians are career politicians that have no clue about technology and much less clue about the ethics, because they just want to win elections. So how do you see this part from your work, and as well some case studies on the bridge between your book and as well the work you've been doing in the World Intellectual Property Organization?
I quite agree that it is important to kind of be educating policymakers who aren't technologists by background, or ethicists, or attorneys. And in recent years, there has been a lot more interest paid to how artificial intelligence is going to affect intellectual property standards, in part because AI is, playing a greater role in creative and inventive industries, even if not an autonomous one. It's been doing this for a long time, but AI has been getting exponentially better and seems to be kind of at the tipping point of really having a more important economic contribution to these fields. And I think it has been very promising to see a couple of forward-leading patent offices like the US Patent and Trademark Office and the UK Intellectual Property Office have recently announced calls for consultation. So they have put out, dozens of questions about how AI and IP are going to interact and what needs to change maybe, or whether systems are fine the way they are. And they've opened this up for stakeholders to be making comments. I think that sort of public engagement process is the right place to start, and to have being done on an ongoing basis, because no one working in silos understands the whole picture. Industry has its perspective about what's going on, patients have their perspective about what's going on, doctors have their perspective about what's going on, government regulators have their perspective, different things are happening in different countries, and having these sorts of forums for stakeholders to be speaking to each other, I think is really critical for promoting public education and then better sorts of policies ultimately. As you point out, artificial intelligence and data, by their, in some sense, intangible nature, are in some sense really global, if you want to call them property, but global, phenomenons. And to really best regulate that sort of thing, at a minimum, countries should be speaking with each other about the sorts of things that they're doing. And in some sense, a lot of this should be harmonized. On the data, for example, there is a lot of benefit to data sharing, and on the technical end, having standards for interoperability and being able to communicate and work with different people's data. There are also, if there are various laws about the ways that you can protect data, or that you could file for protection on things that come out of data, this could lead to a system where you have protection for some activities in some countries, but not others, which may often be problematic. And then, of course, you have the many ethical challenges concerned with data, like privacy and confidentiality, and people misusing data in concerning sorts of ways. And that is also something that countries should be working on together, to have ethical frameworks. And I think the EU is one of the leaders in really ensuring ethical uses of AI, and ensuring that data isn't out there or being used as much as possible in ways that are, being used to discriminate against people, or that are revealing their personal health information. And so, the UN system, I think, is right to be taking a lead in promoting these conversations.
No, amazing. And I think it's completely the way to go. And I hope that this consistency, and I think especially bearing right now that we have, a lot of the geopolitical issues are actually very, very important given what we have here. So I want to touch, so before I go to my next question, I want to just, so any particular case study you want to just highlight for our audience, because we have a lot of entrepreneurs and startups listening to us. So in terms of, especially that you've been working with the World Intellectual Property, any case study that you want to highlight? And I know as well, probably might be a good one, you have the AI Artificial Inventor project that you've been working as well with Dr. Stephen Teller and a lot of other things that you've been working on that. Do you want to just highlight, I don't know if that can be a case study, but it's a bit more complex, but I just would like to highlight these two areas of both the World Intellectual Property and Artificial Inventor.
Sure. Well, I will talk about that case study because it's my case study, so it's my favorite. But maybe I'll start with another case study, which was the World Intellectual Property Organization has now had 3 what they're calling conversations on AI and IP, and I got to participate in the first 2 of them. And in the first one, the chief of intellectual property at Siemens company got up and said, this is something that has happened in our company. We developed a new part for a car, and we wanted to file a patent on it, and we couldn't, because what happened was the engineers put a bunch of data into an artificial intelligence that they hadn't developed. The artificial intelligence said, here is the optimal car part that you want. The engineers all looked at it and said, wow, that's interesting looking, and like, we never would have come up with that, and we think that's great. And when Siemens wanted to file a patent on it, all of the engineers said, well, I didn't invent it, this just came out of a machine. And so that is, I think, a very far example. My book talks about that case study a little bit. That's an example all the way at the margin of, what do you do when you have machines doing this interesting sort of stuff? As you point out, there's not too many clients for whom that's their biggest issue. It is more that, the teams that are being used for invention are getting bigger. They're at more organizations. They're using more technology. They're more interdisciplinary. And who is an inventor is a lot less clear than it used to be. And this is important because the person who invents something is usually the owner in the first instance, although it's usually their employer. But this might be, for example, again, if you have Microsoft and Pfizer collaborating on something, well, does Pfizer own it? Does Microsoft own it? There's all sorts of new potentials for commercial disputes this way that have to be really carefully thought through and worked out in advance. And there hasn't been a lot of law in this area. And so I've been working on this academically for a long time, and I knew Dr. Thaler because I interviewed him for one of my earlier articles. He's, an AI pioneer based in the United States. And, he's been saying for a long time that he has AI that can sort of generate new inventions without a traditional human inventor. So I gathered a group of international patent attorneys, and he had one of his machines generate a couple of inventions. And together we filed patent applications on these inventions. And we filed them in the UK and in Europe. And the offices evaluated them and said, okay, these are patentable inventions. And we did not disclose the inventor. And so then after they said these are patentable, we said, okay, well, these were actually invented by a machine. There is no human being who traditionally qualifies as an inventor. Now give us our patent. And then we also filed these applications in about a dozen other countries. And the UK and Europe rejected them and said, you can't have an invention without a human inventor. And they've been rejected in the US also, and they're still pending in many other jurisdictions. And it is interesting because, one way to interpret the law that says you need a human inventor is, literally that you need one. But of course, in the United States, for example, those laws were written back in the 1950s or earlier, and no one was thinking, well, could you ever not have a human inventor? And there is a reason, most patents are owned by corporations. And if you could allow them not to list a human inventor, then human inventors would lose the credit they deserve and sometimes financial benefits. But again, none of that had anything to do with the idea that, well, maybe one day artificial intelligence would be outputting inventions. So as the law currently stands, there's just no protection for that sort of thing unless you lie about it and put a human being, which is a problem because in the United States, it's a criminal offense to put someone as an inventor on something if they didn't actually qualify as an inventor, right? Or we'd have to say, well, now that AI is producing things, what does it mean to be an inventor? Is it the person who pushes a button? Is it the person who designs the AI? But all of those things have problems because you may have an AI designed by thousands of people over years, and the person who pushes the button may not really know that much, right? And maybe the person who looks at the new car part that comes out and says, oh, this is brilliant, but according to Siemens, basically all their engineers just looked at it and said, how interesting, so it's not really clear that they've done much. So these test cases are helping encourage this conversation that's ongoing, including at WIPO, helping to clarify the law. And we hope that some courts or maybe ultimately legislators are going to realize that there's a problem with the law as it is now, and we need to think about how to change it.
Yeah, that's a massive point, and I think that brings me actually just a bit of an interaction with what you just said. So one of the research I've been doing is that at the moment we have three kinds of interactions. So it's human to human, human to machine, or machine to human, and then you have machine to machine. So we have these three things right now happening. And for instance, like you mentioned, in the case of let's say a patent that was created by AIs, there's a huge amount of data that comes in order for the AI, because AI at the moment learns through data and gets fed with data. And of course, this data was created by someone, but it's taken out of this. And for instance, even me, in the work I'm doing, for instance, I'm using an AI to do films. And I've been challenging the AI to see how creative it can be. And for instance, I noticed that if I put a text, the AI can create an entire film, picking databases of image banks, and then just sometimes starts interacting with my own narrative and other things. Of course, it's still very limited, but it's an interesting example that is already happening. But of course, my creativity, in this case, some of my films that I'm doing using this AI and other things, is that it's a mix of my capacity to orchestrate the images that are done by other people, but they are selling them to image data banks. So I'm entitled to use them because I pay for that. But at the same time, there's all the editing that is done by a software platform, and then there's my creativity on top of that. So this is already happening. And for instance, in the film industry, there's a couple of films that were created completely by AI. The music industry, that's already very processed, which are very creative industries. So how do you see, especially because this is going to accelerate, okay? And like you mentioned, you have to have a human to put a patent, but at the same time, there's a lot of still massive organizations. For instance, if you look at the quantity of patents in AI or quantity of patents in blockchain or other quantities is really, if you are a small startup, you're going to be killed if you touch a part of a patent and a big corporation owns that patent. So this is kind of in one end, a very complex situation because, and as well, for instance, if you are an hacker and you are hacking situations, which I did a research recently about the quantity of hackers there was in the world. I was a bit shocked. Like official, there's a community with 1 million hackers, official. Okay, these are more or less white hackers. So we're talking about a huge percentage of the world population that is working on this. And of course, these people don't care about the copyright or trademark. So I just want to hear your points because as an academic, you have, of course, to keep your research public, and you have, for instance, a huge amount of ResearchGate and as well on your publications in Google Scholar. But then your work right now starting to interact with patents and properties, it's creating a new area, like the project that you just mentioned, the artificial inventor. Actually, I think I suggest everyone listening to us to go to artificialinventor.com. This is a great work, especially people in these areas. Yeah, I just want to understand because these things are happening now. It's not in 5 years, not in 10, but this is happening with a very, very low capacity of AI. And of course, if you look at Ray as well, this says the singularity near is, we're talking about 2040. I would say that it's 2025 or 2030 because we are starting to have already some things happening, but well, not in the sense of like something. But I want to hear your thoughts in this part of the interactions, and as well how you can actually look from an academic perspective, but as well from a legal perspective.
Well, those are great points. I called that phenomenon in one of my articles the creative singularity. You know, with patents, I think our test case is, you know, coming at the right time, but not too late. But, you know, it is a lot more difficult to make something that can get a patent than to make something that can get copyright protection. The bar for copyright protection is incredibly low. And, you know, in the example that you gave, you know, also for a business, it is very complicated there. You know, someone made the AI, or a lot of people made the AI. You gave the AI certain input to have it generate certain output. It used data from who knows where, right? Many people can own that data. Using data like that can be infringement. You know, what sort of protections does the work get? What if there's people in the work? You know, all of these are challenges, and challenges on which there has not been a lot of law. You know, it's interesting to look at the UK. The UK was actually the first country in 1988. Well, I could be slightly off on the law, but under the, there's a provision of copyright law that says if you have a machine make something without a traditional human author, the producer of the work owns the copyright and is legally deemed the author. In the United States, they have gone the opposite direction for a very long time and said, if you don't have a traditional human author, no one owns the thing. So if you have an AI that makes a movie and it's good, right, you can own it in the UK, but not in the US. And, you know, what I think is going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years is that, you know, AI has been making music, some people say, since the 50s. But it's really not good. And those movies that AI has made and the books that AI has written is pretty bad. But just in the past year or two, AI has started writing short articles that people can't tell were written by an AI. And if you go to something like OpenAI Jukebox, you can hear an AI making songs in the sound of Frank Sinatra or Taylor Swift. And they're still a little wonky, like Frank Sinatra singing about hot tubs. But they're not so bad. I mean, if I wasn't listening that closely, I would think that Frank Sinatra was singing that thing. And I think this is really going to be a hugely disruptive commercial thing in 5 or 10 years when AI gets to the point where it can not just do this, but do it in a way that it makes content people want to listen to. And then all of these issues like, well, where did you get your data from? And if you're using Taylor Swift's songs to make a new Taylor Swift song, who has the rights to that? And can you use it as an infringement? And who's pushing the button and who's programming it? And what are they doing? And did they know what it was going to come out with? All of this stuff, there are answers to it, but you know, some of the answers aren't that good yet. And there's a lot of uncertainty, and uncertainty like that is bad for commercial enterprises, right? Businesses need, you know, this is what we can do, this is what we can't do. You know, I don't want to think as a small business that maybe I'm infringing some patent by, you know, Google, and they're going to come after me and I'm going to lose my business, you know, whether or not it's a good patent and I can't hire lawyers and do this sort of thing. And, you know, while you're on ethical questions, you know, it's interesting stuff also to be thinking of, you know, these million actors are pretty soon going to be competing with AI actors. And, you know, maybe AI actors of dead actors who no longer exist, but, you know, people just really want to watch Michael Jackson perform, and who's going to want to see these million people playing in pubs in England? You know, especially if we can't go to pubs in England because COVID's everywhere. So there's a whole lot of really interesting challenges this brings about. I think a lot of businesses haven't really given enough thought to how this is going to impact their industry or what they should be doing now to be prepared for this sort of thing. And so it's exciting we're at least having conversations about it.
So I want to just on this level, there's a paper that you wrote with Alexander Sarge that is punishing artificial intelligence, legal fiction or science fiction. I would love, this is a particular topic that I love. Do you want to just a bit just explain this, because I think it's interesting before I go to my next question.
Sure. So this article is part of the book also, and it you know, the book looks at tax and tort and intellectual property. And one of the things that's interesting about those areas is that the law is often very focused on outcomes and utilitarian outcomes. So with tort law, how do we reduce accidents? With intellectual property, how do we get more inventions or artwork? With tax law, you know, how do we best provide for the public welfare and so forth? But criminal law is a little different than that, right? Criminal law isn't just concerned with discouraging antisocial behavior. It really seems to care about why people do things, right? And so it's an interesting almost thought experiment with AI. You know, if we have AI that's going out and doing useful sorts of things, you know, we're going to have AI out doing bad sorts of things. I mean, it already is. And at what point, you know, is it even possible to think about AI intending to do things or having, or being liable for committing a crime, right? At what point could an AI ever commit a crime? And to be sure, you know, even though AI is out doing bad things, it is just being used as a tool. So if I pick up my laptop and I hit someone on the head with it, you know, that's me committing a battery. It's not a computer committing a battery. You know, even if I have an AI that's promoting disinformation or stealing Bitcoin for people or whatever, that's really just someone using a machine to commit a crime, like running you over. We don't hold my car criminally liable. But as AI gets more advanced and autonomous, we're going to start having situations happen where you can't necessarily take a bad thing done by an AI and say this was a bad thing a person did. You know, because maybe it was a large team of people contributing to an AI, maybe it was an open source AI, you know, and in the same sort of way that we hold companies criminally liable, even though they're made up of people, you know, could we perhaps think about holding a machine liable for something like that, and how would we do it? And so that's what the article is thinking about. You know, we're not in favor of holding AI criminally liable because it would be a huge change to the legal system, and there's really not a need for it. You don't have a bunch of robot Sophias running around terrorizing people right now. But we also found that, you know, it's not such a departure from the law as it is now. Because, for example, we already hold corporations criminally liable, so criminal liability is not just for natural persons. And we don't always require that someone have a negative mindset when they do something wrong to hold them liable for a crime. We have strict liability crimes, for example, you know, with people having sex with minors in some cases, or with people transporting very dangerous materials, where it doesn't matter how careful you were. If you did something, you're criminally liable for it. In fact, sometimes you can have criminal liability for failing to act where you have a duty to act. And so the law already accommodates criminal punishment of artificial entities for failing to act without even a negative mindset. And so, you know, he and I kind of went through and thought about, well, what would it be like to criminally punish machines, and what would you have to have? And could you think of machines as thoughtful actors in some sort of sense? And, you know, again, what we came to was, well, there's really no need to do that, and it would be very disruptive and harmful, you know, but theoretically, you know, machines can act in ways that we attribute thought to. You know, we don't know what someone often was actually doing when they commit a crime, but we infer their thoughts from the behavior. And, you know, robots are the right sort of subject of regulation.
Oh, completely. That's amazing. So I think I want to go to the next one, and I think we passed 1 hour, but if you have still a bit of time, I would like to continue a bit more. So, so you are an expert as well in the areas of life sciences and, of course, healthcare, and especially in relationship with AI. So can you elaborate a bit the way you see? Because of course, at least my main concern is, of course, if you look at data, the most precious data is our health, and the information about our health. And as well, if you look this in the context of a country, you can actually start making decisions. For instance, if you look at the Nazis, they're using the first IBM machines, and that is public information, that is public, to actually decide how to, unfortunately, do, well, mass murder of, in this case, a part of a population that was the Jewish community. And they use actually the first basic computers that were the IBM machines. So, of course, this was 70 years ago, and now we have a capacity that it goes to completely level. Now, I want to just get a scenario and then provoke you on that scenario. So the scenario is that, let's say you do very easily, you target the social network and you get like 10 million people or 20 million people, which I can do that myself. So it's quite scary what you can do. Let's say you get 10 million people, and then somehow you get this 10 million people information about their health care information. And then you just segment the data with an analytics, and very basic analytics. You can understand, okay, people with this DNA might be more propense to have cancer, these ones might be propense to live this quantity of time, and these ones smoke or whatever. So that means you can actually mostly data crunch all the population of these 10 million people. And then it comes the God question. Okay, so you can see, okay, these people don't study, these people have very bad credit score. Are we going to take them in society, or are we going to just take them out of society? So I would like to use this case study to look at the considerations around, of course, ethics, but AI and healthcare, and as well the legal implications of this, because we're not far from this scenario. And for instance, if you put a smart contract on the middle of this, or using some blockchain, you can even make sure that you control the entire data and use it for good or for bad. So I want to touch this because it's something that I think people are not touching too much, but this is actually can happen very fast.
Well, it is certainly a chilling scenario. You know, obviously that's not, at least the way you've laid it out, not the sort of thing we want to be letting people do. I mean, essentially what you're, you know, the scenario you're painting is just kind of, you know, government or private actor discrimination on the basis of healthcare information, and AI is simply enabling it to be much easier to do that, right? And I think this is, again, an example where, you know, that underlying premise is one that we already deal with as a society, and AI is just making it a lot easier to do it, right? And so we have laws that prohibit that sort of discrimination, both by government actors and in some cases by private actors. So, you know, you can't not hire someone because of their cancer risk. You know, potentially you could not hire someone over some of their credit scores. And, you know, there are difficult kind of social and moral and ethical lines about the sorts of things that are okay to use against someone, right? I mean, genetics, or at least, you know, kind of in Western society, kind of clearly thought to be off limits for discriminating against someone. someone's credit score being, a less clear-cut example, but something, we also should have a lot of concern about using. And so I think this is why governments need to be thinking about regulation, particularly in the context of AI, because we know we don't want that sort of activity. And now that it has become a lot easier to discriminate against that, how do we prevent it from being done, right? And, maybe one way is limiting the ability of social media networks to collect or disseminate certain sorts of data that are used in concerning sorts of ways. The other point I would make about this, though, is that, this gets into also concerns related to algorithmic bias, which I think it is fairly well established that a lot of algorithms now being used behave in concerning sorts of ways. For example, algorithms being used to make hiring decisions based on CVs. But again, this is not new stuff. And, human resource managers have been making biased decisions on human CVs, as long as they've been doing it. And it is very difficult to both detect that sort of bias and to correct for it. And so just as AI has the ability to kind of increase discrimination and make it easier, I think AI also has the potential to limit human discrimination and make it more difficult, because we can ask of an AI, well, why are you declining these applications? Is it because of someone's race or someone's genetics or a proxy for one of those things? And we can decide in a more thoughtful sort of way whether that sort of thing should be allowed or not, right? I mean, clearly not allowed on the basis of race, but you can say to a hiring manager, you're not allowed to discriminate on the basis of race. And of course they will say yes. Right, but it's very hard to actually stop them from doing that. And sometimes they're not even aware they're doing it. It's an unconscious bias. Whereas with an AI, it's easier to see if they're doing it and to just make rules to keep it from doing that. So I think, in answer to the dystopian kind of discrimination concerns, they're very real concerns. It's something that regulators need to work to help prevent. It's something that private actors and companies need to have on their radar about things they're preventing, but also something that AI may actually make a significant positive difference with.
Okay, I like your positive part. We need that.
So tough days, you got to stay at least a little bit positive.
No, I think, like you said, I think it's about a lot about, and I think your role as a teacher is key. I think one of the things I created this YouTube channel mostly because I understood that I think I can give voice, first of all, to a lot of my ideas, but I can learn with people like you, but as well, we can share and take it to the world because, of course, YouTube has all these kind of theories of conspiration, but has a lot of fantastic things as well. So you just need to highlight, and as well, I think there's a sense of responsibility, especially the big data providers, like from Google to Facebook and Amazon's and all the others, because they have a massive responsibility. And of course, the challenge is that, for instance, I was doing a study of the most influential people in the history of humanity. And of course, the most influential people are normally researchers or academics or geniuses or whatever, people that create something that creates humanity. But if you look at probably, and I'm not saying this with any compliment, but of course he has his credit, is Mark Zuckerberg is probably the most powerful person in history of humanity because he has 60% of the voting rights of the Facebook board. And he owns the data of 1.5 to 2 billion people. So,
plus,
and that's it.
I have it on good authority that he is actually a robot. So, maybe the AI than we think.
Well, the point is that if a robot or not, he is the major shareholder of the board. So I think that's a lot of responsibility to have in one single person for 2 billion people. And nothing against him because he did it all legal. So actually, to be fair to him, whether you like it or not, he did it under the law. Now, of course, the point is that the law didn't go so fast as it did. But I think effectively that's the challenge that we have right now. And the same, for instance, with Jeff Bezos, that has, let's say, if the stock goes up, it makes $20 billion in one day. So that's the paradoxes that we have in our human civilization, that it's so advanced, but has so much issues. But well, coming on the positive side, so I think from coming back to the AI and health science or life sciences, any examples from your work and from your research that you want to highlight? You mentioned on the AI and patents, and as well creative, or at least in the part of inventions, on the area of AI and health of life sciences.
Well, I mean, I think there's a number of other kind of very interesting, you know, legal and ethical and moral questions about AI in the life sciences in particular. You know, one that we didn't kind of touch on was AI in practice, you know, kind of in patient care. And it is interesting that there are a number of companies that are now saying that they have AI that can outperform a human doctor. Not in general, of course, but in very specific sorts of things. So, for example, you know, looking at a skin lesion or a pathology slide and being better than a human doctor at detecting certain sorts of cancer, or you know, looking at, you know, lung imaging from an x-ray or a CT scan and, you know, diagnosing pneumonia or, you know, fibrosis or something in a lung. You know, it may be that AI gets to do a better job than a person at that. And, you know, that's not surprising to me that AI can do that. And we are a very long way off from seeing an AI instead of a doctor. But I would expect in the next 5 or 10 years also to have AI kind of outperforming human doctors at some non-trivial things. You know, in 20 years, when I was in medical school, I got to play around with a Da Vinci robot a little bit, which is a surgical robot. And, you know, it is really just a sophisticated scalpel. You know, but 20 years from now, that Da Vinci robot may be able to detect someone's cancer and cut it out better than a human surgeon, faster than a human surgeon, with fewer side effects and more effectively removing it. And it's going to be interesting to have a patient go into a surgeon and the surgeon say, well, you can get, you know, you can have me do your surgery, you can have the robot do the surgery, but I have to tell you the robot does a much better job than me, you know, 99% of the time. Which one do you want to use? You know, I think that, you know, we almost have a moral imperative in some sense to integrate AI into things like patient care. And in fact, at some point, probably to be transitioning out human services, because I think it would be, you know, concerning to even have the human surgeon or the human radiologist as an option at some point in the future when AI comes to dramatically outperform people. And so I think, you know, there's a lot of critical reasons for encouraging and developing that sort of technology now so that we get there sooner, because I think that's going to be a place where, you know, some people see that as dystopian. You know, I see that ultimately as a very positive sort of thing. You know, I would much rather have a healthcare option that is more efficient. And, you know, as a doctor myself, if that means there's, you know, or a lawyer myself, if that means there's some sorts of things I don't do, you know, like discovery and litigation or doing certain sorts of surgery, you know, there's lots of other things that I can do and find time for. You know, if eventually we get to a future where AI can just do everything better than we can, you know, including kind of interviewing people on YouTube, you know, and it'll be interviewing itself, you know, what would we do with our day? And would that be a terrible thing? And I tend to think that would be a good thing. We would have, as a society, really an unlimited amount of wealth, and people wouldn't have to work, and we would have to come up with a system to make it distributionally fair so that it's not Jeff Bezos owning, you know, $1 trillion and everyone else being poor. We'd have to have a universal basic income. You know, but then people could spend their days pursuing self-improvement or cultivating personal relationships, or if they wanted to, playing Fortnite in virtual reality all day. I mean, who am I to tell them how to get there? But I think that sort of thing, if it's technologically possible, is going to happen inevitably and not something that we should be concerned about as a negative thing. I think we should be concerned about making sure that we get there efficiently and in a way that isn't leaving people behind.
Yeah, no, I'm completely with you. Although I would prefer that we create a kind of a coexist and probably more Star Trek. Actually, I start seeing more Star Trek to understand a visualization of narratives, because I think it's all about narratives if you look at history of humanity. But no, I want to go from and I think we passed almost 1.5 hours now, but I still have 2 questions at least I would like to touch, and then I'll let it rest. And I think we might get a second round in the near future, probably with interaction. So, of course, in terms of your area of research, of course, it's AI and law, which you are a global leader on that area. So in terms of, at the moment, we have legal tech, reg tech, and all these areas that are emerging and that are actually touching a lot of ways and concrete examples of bringing this to society. and actually creating a lot of solutions from DocuSigns to elements like this. And of course, blockchain, there's a lot of things that even the work of the lawyers will be replaced by code and by smart contract. Of course, we still have to have experts in law and tech, which is going to be another thing. So any kind of areas that you would like to highlight, given your research and the work you've been doing both with the World Intellectual Property Organization or the patents, different organizations that you've been involved?
Do you mean kind of areas in which I think that machines will be automating kind of human legal or commercial activity?
Yeah, both that, but as well some case studies or platforms that you would like to highlight. Because I think one of the things that I think that is coming out of this research is that we have platforms that can help us in the present. And I think then people forget that. And I think like your artificial inventor, there is a fantastic research for people that are looking for patents, research, and invention.
Sure. Well, I'll think of a couple examples for people who are interested. They can go check them out. You know, in the world of law, you know, kind of like in the world of medicine, you know, it's a very complex environment and one that is not naturally ambitious about bringing on technology and automation. There are a lot of companies that are doing new and exciting legal tech things, and I have not found, some firms are very forward thinking about it, and a lot of good big firms have people who look very closely at that sort of stuff and are bringing it on. You know, I think there is a little resistance with traditional business models, you know, in part because of the way that firms bill hourly, and, you know, I don't know that they have all the incentives to be kind of ambitious enough about trying to disrupt their own business models, you know, at least until that, you know, gets forced upon some of them. You know, there are some great platforms like Specifio is one that I'm very fond of. You know, that is a company where you can give a patent claim. So like one sentence, like, you know, this compound for treatment of COVID, and the software will entirely generate a patent application for you. Now, that's not something that you would want to rush out and file on, right? It is something that you would want a patent attorney to review carefully first. But it's something that could take writing a patent application from 15 hours down to 5. And if you were paying that person $400 an hour, really there's a lot of cost savings and things like that. You know, so there are a lot of innovative products like that. And, you know, I think there does need to be a better platform for, you know, law firms and big law kind of bringing on and utilizing platforms like that. I mean, another one I'm very fond of is a company called Ping, which does automated timekeeping for lawyers. And, you know, that's nice because the worst part of being a lawyer is probably recording your own hours. So lawyers like it that they don't have to record their hours. Clients like it that it actually makes recording your hours more accurate. And, you know, firms like it because actually, strangely enough, lawyers tend to underbill their hours. And when this sort of thing is being automated, you know, billings go up. So, you know, those are a couple of legal tech companies that I'm like, you know, IP Rova is another one, and they are using AI to help companies invent more diversely. So rather than kind of automating inventive activity, they are helping to use AI to help inventors and companies invent in ways they wouldn't have thought of before by bringing in effectively kind of different disciplines and different, you know, sorts of prior art or literature into the inventive process. So that's 3 that were off the top of my head that I'm fond of.
Fantastic. So I'll probably ask some notes on that because I want to make sure that I spell it right, because one of them I knew, the others no. So I think this is great, especially the one about patents. Can you repeat the name of the one about patents?
The one about patents is Specifio. Let me. SPEC.
No worries, we'll take it afterwards, but it's just, I'm just curious. No, very good. Thank you so much. No, because I think it's great for our audience, because I think sometimes what I feel is that people, it's very easy to get in the macro issues and forget the great things that are happening. And I think if we talk about the great things, we start getting a bit more on the narrative and to get out of the scenario of the paranoia and especially all this kind of crazy theories of conspiration that have been actually mostly created by precisely these technologies that we are working together. Okay, so the one of the last questions I have, and then I would like to get one on ethics, but I'll leave that for the last. So in terms of, so you've been working as well in the areas of patents and trademark and all these different areas. So now going more down to earth, and I think, for instance, there's a couple of very specific things. For instance, the on the artificial inventory, you mentioned that there's been all that area that you've been working and looking as well in terms of making sure that there's what is the patent by the robot, what is the patent by the humans. But coming down to earth and it coming down to, let's say, for examples of startups, and there's, for instance, I did a research, so there's 430 million micro SMEs in the world. Let's put it that way. Micro SMEs is a bit less according to the different numbers because the data is not completely credible. We have, if you look at one number, it comes one way, it comes another one. Even the data is still very blurred. But a lot of new startups, let's say if you look at Crunchbase, we're talking about potentially a couple of millions of startups that have like a solid background, that have solid management and solid people that are trying to push forward. So all of these companies are struggling with the things we're talking here, especially to make sure a product that is completely patented by a big corporation and they will be killed in 5 minutes. So any kind of from both your expertise in working with some industry players and big organizations, but as well with your work with Surrey and different universities, any advice you give, because I think it's very important that we get down to earth and we look at the day-to-day operations on, of course, keeping the macro, and that's why we are humans, because we have capacity for ideas. But any concrete case studies in the case of startups, innovation, and technology?
Well, I'm sure I could think of some relevant case studies. I mean, if you were asking generally for startups kind of being advised on IP, you know, it is difficult because it is expensive to deal with IP, and you know, big companies have a lot of institutional knowledge and in-house legal teams, and everyone is trained in this and what they need to be doing, and they can go out and hire firms that charge very large amounts of money, and small businesses really can't do that. You know, I think it is important for small businesses to have an advisor who understands strategically what is really critical to the business, right? You know, does your business need a patent? Why does it need a patent? You know, do you need to be applying for trademark protection, and where? What are the risks that you're looking at? And someone who both understands that from a startup perspective, where it's very different from a big company perspective, and you know, who can do it cost effectively, because you know, small businesses can't apply for a bunch of patents everywhere around the world, and you know, it is also very difficult for small businesses to do freedom to operate analyses, you know, and make sure that they are not infringing someone's software, or that it's someone who is going to enforce it against them in a disastrous sort of way. You know, so I think, you know, for a startup, I think that someone should learn kind of a basic amount about intellectual property. And I think, you know, one of the nice things that WIPO does is it has a small business division, and they put out guides to understanding intellectual property, and it is very industry specific. You know, the sorts of things that you need to know about IP are very different if you're in medical devices, or, you know, making artwork, or making computer software. So I think, you know, small businesses would be well advised to kind of learn the basic issues, and then find either a lawyer or a strategic advisor who really knows their stuff, and, you know, get kind of specific concrete guidance. And even though that can be a bit expensive, you know, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
No, but, very good advice, and I appreciate it myself, because sometimes we all forget that. And I think especially a lot of startups can only scale if they have this in mind, because of course, if you don't scale this, and of course, like you mentioned, WIPO is a fantastic segment. I've been actually there a lot of times myself, that has education, courses, and most of them for free that people can get. And sometimes and even your papers, so you have fantastic papers that people should read, because you learn a lot. Like the artificial inventory is a fantastic learning knowledge, because I've been learning a lot preparing for this interview, and as well researching, and I'm going to continue. So I want to touch one. I have two last questions, but depends because they are a bit big. But one of them is a paper of yours as well that is listed and as well you studied as well some different areas, but it's part of your Google Scholar. But I want to touch this because we didn't touch this, but this is particularly interesting because it's reverse engineer everything we're talking here about. So so you have this is a paper you did in 2011 that is medical student attitudes towards complementary, alternative, and integrative medicine, and evidence-based complementary and alternative medicine. So I'm particularly interested in this because I've been actually finding a bridge between conventional medicine and alternative medicine, or massage, acupuncture, and a lot of these things. And for me, massage has been actually one of the things that has been helping me stabilizing my body, because I have blood circulation, and it really makes a massive difference, especially with my blood circulation and a lot of other issues. But there's a huge component, especially in these areas of, we have all this advanced technology, and now we are talking about human engineering and things like that. But then there's an entire historical kind of overground of information that we have. So I would like to see about this paper, and as well how you look at this, because it's an area that I know that is dear for you as well from your research.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is interesting. In some sense, it's almost the opposite of, the high-tech area. It's low-tech, high-touch. There are a lot of medical practices that are, not part of conventional medicine, that are used successfully by large segments of the population since time immemorial. And there's a lot of interesting, issues associated with that. It is, it would be nice to have double-blind, randomized, controlled trials to see whether massage works for, say, issues related to blood flow. The problem is, we get that for COVID. It costs billions of dollars to do that sorts of research. And it only gets done because there's a pharmaceutical company at the end of the day that's going to make a bunch of money on IP, and the drugs have to be very expensive. So, we're never going to have that threshold of evidence, but on the other hand, it is something that has been used safely for a long time. And, it is something which you have directly experienced a benefit from. The cost of it is very modest compared to, some of these other high-tech treatments out there. And so, there is really room for many of these therapies to be brought into conventional medicine, where they are things that have been used for a long time, where patients have found them effective, where they are low cost, where there is, other sorts of research showing that patients report good outcomes, even if it's not in randomized controlled trial settings. I think there's a lot of value in these sorts of medicines, but of course they have to be used appropriately. So, if you got hit by a bus, I wouldn't go to an acupuncturist. I would, go to a trauma center. If I had cancer, I would be getting acupuncture, but I wouldn't be doing it instead of chemotherapy, right? I mean, I would be seeing a Western doctor, and then it would be seeing an acupuncturist to help with my energy and with side effects from chemotherapy and that sort of thing. So, there is a tremendous, I think, value in these practices that has not been optimally integrated with conventional medicine, and a lot of it has been, bias on both sides. And I think, there is a lot of value there that we have yet to tap. And in some ways, to bring these two things together, as modern scientific drug discovery kind of investigates more and more of traditional medicine, we find things to be of value. A lot of modern pharmaceutical drugs come from herbal medicines, and many times in ways that align with the way they were traditionally used in medicine. In fact, in the United States in the past several years, we've had 2 botanical drugs approved as prescription drugs. One is a green tea extract for genital warts, and one is a tree sap for diarrhea for HIV/AIDS patients. And so, those have actually been, fully scientifically vetted as being effective, though the costs of them as prescription drugs are quite high. There's a company called Eviva, which is a Yale spin-out, which is investigating a traditional Chinese medicine as a chemotherapy adjuvant. And that's in phase 2 trials right now in the United States. And if that drug is shown to be effective, then we will see that there is it is their own proprietary version of a traditional Chinese formula. So it is a different drug, but it is it is based on traditional Chinese medicine, is something that is shown to be effective now for cancer, or will be in these future trials.
Yeah, I think I love the way you put it, and as well, I think coming back to Professor Ari, there was one quote from him that I love. That is, the sense is that like this is our cultural historical operating system, which is part as well of what kept, well, we pick part of that or not, but I think it's important to keep it as well as part of our good heritage of what means to be human. So this takes me to my last question. And it's been a fantastic journey. So I appreciate your time and generosity. So we touched a lot of the advances of AI and law and a bit of ethics as well. So I would like just, as someone that has both a background in science and medicine, and as well, of course, in technology and law. So especially at the moment, we are in a crossroad where definitely you are looking at human engineering, life sciences for life extension. And there's already a lot of people, for instance, Peter Thiel invest like $100 million in the company to life extension. And even if you look for the last 100 years, let's say in the beginning of the 20th century, the average time span of humanity was around 40 years old. So now we're talking about 78 to 80, in some cases goes to 100. And in some cases, we are already passing like an average of 110. So it's quite reasonable to affirm that the next decades, our children or the children of them will go to like 200 or even 500 years. So this creates a huge, in the middle of all this complexity of AI, creates a lot of as well superhuman beings, or whatever we can call it. So how do you see this both from the perspective of ethics, because law and ethics sometimes are parallel, because the law tries to emulate the ethics in its best, but sometimes it gets a lot of diametrics. So how do you see these areas? Just as my last, I know there is a big question, but just touching it, and we might have then another wrap up in the future.
Oh, that sounds great. Well, I guess the two sorts of things that occur to me are, well, 2 to 500 years doesn't seem too long for me to live. I don't think that we are constrained by resources for people living longer like that. I think, people who are living longer and more productive could probably add to the pool of resources, and it's a good reason for us to kind of increase our stewardship of our natural environment. I think for me, the ethical concern that seems most pressing when I hear that is the idea that, Peter Thiel will get to live to be 500 and everyone else is going to die at 80, right? And I think that there is an ethical and a moral obligation when these technologies exist to make them widely available and not to create further disparities in, the haves and the have-nots. And so, I think that would be my sense of what we should be concerned about looking at this.
I think you made it very synthetic and sharp. So I appreciate, it's been a fantastic journey, right? So I want to thank you for your time and for your fantastic insights. And definitely, I think we'll come back to a new one when we rest from this one. But there's a lot of things that have made me think, and I think everyone listening to us will probably feel the same and try to engage as well. Thank you so much. And we'll put also all the links to your multiple papers. And I think your name is all over the internet, but we'll try as well to put links in the documentation and the places where we're syndicating the interview. Thank you so much, Ryan.
It was a real pleasure being here and an honor, and I can't thank you enough for the time.
No, it's all my honor, and I'm very humble because it's great points and a learning curve for me as well. Thank you so much.